to Community Circle Conversations here on August 19th. Just always want to set a reminder around our goals and how we come together. We're hosting these community circles and conversations to seek to build trusting relationships and share knowledge and resources with the Central Iowa nonprofit sector. Our expectations, especially in our breakout rooms, are to center dialogue around these common goals and remain rooted to equity and inclusion. And just a reminder for you who are joining us this morning, if you're able to mute and turn off your video, during the presentation period, we'll invite you to turn those on for our breakout sessions. So let's go to the next slide and I'll kind of outline what we are going to be doing today. So today is trauma-informed supervision presentation. And I have the pleasure when I'm putting these slides together of getting a little bit of a preview. And I'll just tell you, I'm really excited for this session. I think it's something that, we've been talking a lot about, but Lisa Couchat from Iowa ACEs 360 is going to be presenting and has a lot of expertise in this area. So
Nice.
Lisa, Lisa, welcome. We'll invite Lisa Couchat to start her video and audio, and then we'll get started here in just a minute. So if you are not the presenter, I'd ask you just to turn off your video and your audio for me while we get started. Oh, and there's Lisa. All right. Let's see. Sometimes I got to find you in this in this group. Good. Well, Lisa, thank you so much. I did also want to share that you are a strategic collaboration grantee. Iowa ACEs 360 received a strategic collaboration grant in the first round of funding. And so we had been talking about some of your work and really excited to invite you to share this morning. So I know you have a lot to get through, so I'll be quiet and I'll let you take over. And those who have questions, feel free. You can ask those in the chat box and I can pop on and voice those to Lisa. And she has to leave us at 9, but if there are any questions that aren't answered, we can go ahead and check in with her and see if we can get some of those answers to you kind of after the fact. So Lisa, I will invite you to start from the beginning.
Great. Well, thanks, Brianne, and thanks everyone for letting me join today. I'm really excited to chat with everyone about what we feel is a really important topic during this time, and that is ensuring that we have leadership within our organizations that is trauma informed as we move through this pandemic, and also now as we move through the natural disaster that just occurred as well. And so I want to start off on the next slide and go through some just key terms. A lot of times when we talk about trauma-informed supervision or we talk about secondary traumatic stress, especially for those working in the nonprofit field, we use one term to address all of it. And there's actually some very distinct things related to trauma in the workplace that we want to call out. So I'm going to just really briefly go through a few of these key terms. So pre-pandemic, some of the things that may have been happening below the waterline, that we may have seen some behaviors that were coming out in the workplace that were indicative of trauma. Some of the things below the waterline and the terms we used are listed here on the screen. Secondary traumatic stress is something we hear about quite a bit. I think a lot of us use the term, again, all-encompassing and not going through some of those finer distinctions. But secondary traumatic stress is when we have that indirect exposure to trauma, whether it's through our workplace or someone we love or someone in our community. Burnout, which is something we are no stranger to in the nonprofit field, that's when what we often see when We have very intense work, very long work, but don't necessarily have the supports to recover from it, or to process or to take a break from the work that we're doing. Moral distress is that gap between our work and our values and beliefs, particularly those who work in health and human services, but it is true for all of nonprofit work. There are times where we make a decision for a family or a client, or they make a decision that we don't agree with or don't necessarily think is in their best interest, and so there's that gap with our values. Or from a legal perspective, there's a judge order, or a legal requirement that we have to do something that we know the policy is not in the best interest of those we work with, but we are legally required to do it, and that's another place we see a lot of moral distress. Vicarious trauma is when you have that shift in your worldview because you're actually somewhat experiencing it with either an individual you work with, or again, someone who's close to you or in your community. And compassion fatigue is that exhaustion related to caregiving, whether it be, again, that caregiving from someone in our life personally, or that exhaustion from doing this kind of work constantly, and just the heaviness that can occur over a course of time. So those are some of the things that we saw pre-pandemic. Those are some of the terms I just wanted to start with to give a baseline of what we mean when we're talking about trauma and concerns from a supervision perspective. So next, what we're going to look through is, again, prior to the pandemic, above the waterline, we might not always necessarily see something that pinpoints, oh, that's secondary traumatic stress, or oh, that's vicarious trauma. What we are typically going to see above the waterline are some typical behaviors from those in our workplace. Maybe we have an individual who used to be really great at dealing with complex issues, but over time, due to the stress they're experiencing and the trauma, vicarious trauma they're experiencing, they may have difficulty addressing and embracing that complexity. We may have staff that are really preoccupied with particular clients or particular stories, and it's just especially weighing heavy on them, or a particular issue that we're dealing with in our nonprofit. Individuals might start to feel isolated or become isolated. Those are just a few of the things that even pre-pandemic, that's what we would typically see and notice first. That's maybe a behavior that's indicating something bigger is going on before the waterline. So before the pandemic, when I would talk to folks about trauma-informed supervision, regardless of the sector or type of work that they did, there are a few key things that we'd always say. Notice those symptoms or behaviors, see what's going on, look at any changes in symptoms or behaviors that we would typically see of our staff. Look at the types or frequency or duration of exposure. So if we have someone who's working with an individual or a family and has multiple really difficult cases, identifying some of those patterns that are going on in their workload. Or if you have a team member who has several really difficult projects that aren't going well and they're kind of building up on them. So identifying what's going on in their work life. And then lastly, we would always say, tailor your supervision strategies to the exposure and the impact, not the symptoms. Okay, so not just addressing the behaviors that you see above the waterline, but what are those things that are causing those symptoms or behavior? So again, that's what we would typically say in a non-pandemic environment. So when we go to the next slide, I really love this quote talking about that expectation that we can be immersed in suffering or lost and not be touched by it is expecting to walk through the water without getting wet. When you work in the nonprofit field and you're caring for the community, whether it's from an arts perspective, whether it's from a human service perspective, the work can be difficult. And I think we have this idea that when you work in the nonprofit field. It's so feel good. It just rises above all the challenges that may come from working in the field. But that's an unrealistic expectation that we put on ourselves and that we put on our team members. So when we talk about trauma-informed supervision, it's not about trying to avoid the stress, because that is completely unrealistic. It's about the swimming lessons, the life rafts, the building better boats. We need to, as leaders, make sure our teams have the skills, the resources, and the leadership within the organization to help process those difficult times and be able to successfully do our work. But then something happened. So then we have, our managing our trauma-informed supervision and our trauma-informed work. And then, as we talk about in the next slide, COVID happened. We have this work that's already difficult, as rewarding and fulfilling as it can be. It's already difficult. And then we get thrown into this situation, not only in our personal lives, but our work lives too, where we're facing really 4 key things that we talk about: grief, fear, less access to our typical coping mechanisms, and what we call all of me all the time. So I'm going to talk about each of these just briefly individually and how we might be seeing these in the workplace. With grief, there's this tension, and really when we look at all of these things, there's this little bit of push and pull within our organizations, within our teams, because not everyone is going to react the same. But there's this tension that if you're not working in the office place, it's still the same job, you're just in a different location, everything's fine. Versus this belief that, or this feeling that this is not business as usual. I can't do my work as usual. So some of the things that we see at this point are that anticipatory grief, what I've lost now, what I might lose in the future. And that goes along a bit with the cumulative or comparative loss. So we saw a lot of folks struggling. Let's say they had seniors in high school, those normal rites of passage through senior year, the school year starting and the difference in what school years are going to look like. Those changes, missing weddings, missing funerals, not being able to be with loved ones, in the workplace, not having the freedom to go in and check on families when we need to, check in on clients, sit down and have those coffee breaks with our colleagues when we need to. We're missing some of that companionship. And very much like grief that we typically talk about in day-to-day life, the grief of these situations, we see bargaining, we see denial, and we see anger. Those are all very common and normal reactions to the grief that we're experiencing related to COVID. And we also see that our reactions to it and the grief we're experiencing, it's not necessarily rational and it's not necessarily linear. We can be doing okay for a while and then we fall back a little bit, because I don't think any of us expected to be sitting here in August and not having made as much progress related to the pandemic and getting back to a quote unquote normal life as we hoped. So that's grief. Next, we're going to talk about reduced access to coping strategies. On a good day and in positive supervision going on in our field, whether you're the leader of the organization or managing a team or managing volunteers, we really talk about self-care. How are you taking care of yourself? What are your coping strategies? What are those things you're doing to balance the heaviness or the intensity that work in the nonprofit field can sometimes be? But all of a sudden, these coping strategies may not be available. Gyms, playgrounds, social gatherings, getting together with colleagues or friends. Even when we can get together, they're a little bit less satisfying because we're worried about what will happen, transmission that'll happen. Are we putting ourselves at risk? In addition to that, because of the increased threat from the pandemic, our body's alarm system is just constantly engaged. And that may result us from filtering out good things, positive things that are happening in our workplace, positive things that are happening in our life. And so it's hard for us to go through a period of recovery related to this pandemic because it's still there and it's still ongoing for our staff and our teams and for ourselves. And then we also find numbing. Because there's just so much going on and so many stressors this year that have, in addition to the pandemic, that are really causing all of us to take some inner look and reflection at ourselves and how we're interacting with others, how we're doing our work. We're really seeing folks become numb to all these changes in the environment. And the challenge with that numbing is it actually disrupts connection and can further exacerbate that isolation or further exacerbate that lack of access to coping strategies. So we have this tension again in the workplace. We have some members on our team, or maybe even within our own selves, we have times where we're like, we got this, I can do it, we can get through this, we're in it for the long haul, versus I or we can't do it anymore, it's too much, I don't have any balance to recede from this difficult time. So that's coping strategies. Then we have fear. Whether it's being physically sick, whether we have folks in our lives or those we work with that are at higher risk, being a carrier. I know for myself, that's one of the things that most stresses me out is the potential of being a carrier and who I could be taking it to or who I could be passing it to. Not being able to be with loved ones or being with loved ones at a reduced amount. There's the stress of the economy, and I know we really feel this in the nonprofit sector because we're getting a little bit lost at times from the discussion in the economic recovery. So there's this fear of, am I going to lose my job? What's the financial security of myself, my staff, my organization? What is the long-term look at how we're going to get through this pandemic? And there's just fear of the unknown. So again, we see this push-pull. For those in human services or direct services with families and clients, some of the tension that we see is I put the families I serve at risk because I'm social distancing. And we hear that a lot, like I need to get in, I need to see my families, I need to see the kids, see how they're doing, I can't do it through a computer. Versus that internal feeling of, but if I go and do my work, if I go and keep my organization running or my program running, there is an inherent risk I'm placing on my family. And so we have all this kind of push-pull feeling of that risk and that fear that's going on in all of us and also all of our staff. And then the last area that we'll talk about is the all of me all the time. And not that we didn't feel this before, but now more than ever, we can't separate from different pieces of our life, especially if you have any amount of your staff that are working from home or staff that don't have to be in the workplace that are working from home. It's been true this summer, and especially as we head into this fall with differing school environments, those who are parenting kids, we have multiple roles that we are now, instead of segmenting throughout the day, we're doing all of them at the same time and trying to keep everything afloat. There was one report that came out shortly after the pandemic started that saw a major increase in productivity between midnight and 3 p.m. because that was the only think time individuals could get for doing their work. And while at the start it was kind of nice to think about, I could work from home, I can wear sweatpants all day, be comfy on my couch and do this work. And then some folks have found, hey, I don't necessarily like this, or I can do this some of the time, but not all the time because I don't feel like I'm productive, or I don't have constant ability to bounce ideas off. So with this all of me all the time, there's again this tension. We feel like we're never doing enough, that we're never keeping our work afloat, challenges with leading our teams or organizations. And then we also feel like we're never doing enough with our family, our kids, keeping the house clean. Why is our house not clean when we're home all the time? I always should be doing more. But at the same time, also feeling I am so tired because I never stop doing anything. I have no break at all. So those 4 areas are the things that we're really seeing. Again, not that they weren't present before, but they're very much intensified due to the pandemic. So when we go to the next slide here, just kind of as a overall look at what we're seeing, the tip of the iceberg, what we're seeing kind of above the waterline here, in addition, that's a reflection of all the types of stress and trauma that we're experiencing as individuals in the field, is we have fear-based decision making. We're forcing decisions into us over versus them. Maybe our staff's getting divided. Are we doing what's best for the agency, or are we doing what's best for people? From a leadership perspective, we're seeing increased oversight or requiring increased accountability or compliance, maybe putting more on our staff members' plates because we want them to prove that, that they're doing their work and using their time wisely. At times, we can see from a leadership perspective a focus on equality over equity, requiring the same things of all of our staff without recognizing that we don't do it with our clients, or we don't do it with our volunteers or our donors on a daily basis, but for some reason we're doing that with our staff right now, rather than taking it from an equity perspective and meeting our staff where they're at. Realizing that a single parent who's trying to work and do the job and not have access to childcare may need different things from you as a leader and from an organization than a staff member who has the ability and the supports to be able to work their typical schedule right now. Or for those that are at increased risk for health, or their communities at increased risk for health issues related to the pandemic. They may need something different than other staff members. But we have this tendency right now as leaders to address the situation to focus on that equality, and that may not be what our staff needs. Also, from a communication perspective, you kind of see these 2 overloads. It's getting a little bit better, but we tend to either overload our organizations and our staff overload back to us with communication via email and phone calls and texts, or it's non-existent. And then our decision making, both among our individual team makers and as leaders, we may be avoiding making decisions because we're waiting for things to get a little bit better, or to hear about that grant, or to see if we get some relief in some fashion, versus making immediate decisions without taking all the factors into place. So those are some of the things we're seeing from a leader perspective overall. But here's the great news, is that all of this is going on, and we have these added stress of the pandemic, but how we get through it is building connection and compassion satisfaction. At its core, what trauma does is it destroys connection between individuals, and that's what we're seeing in our workplaces right now, and that's what you may be seeing among your team members. Compassion satisfaction and getting back to that enjoyment of work even during pandemic times is absolutely critical. So all those things I talked about in the beginning related to how we address trauma-informed supervision, how we support our staff who are going through difficult times. The things that work for healing and wellness when we're working with traumatized kids and families, it also works for staff. It also works for the organizations we lead, and it also works in a pandemic. Now, do we need to be more intentional and to be more focused because the pandemic is increasing all of us as leaders now? Absolutely. But there is a long body of research around trauma-informed supervision and things that work that we can tap into during this time that haven't changed just because we happen to be in a pandemic. So I'm going to talk real briefly about a few of those things. Building connection requires us to do things like talk to our teams about things other than work, validate their struggles, have that mutual vulnerability, because as leaders, we are also sharing in this experience with our staff and with our clients and with our donors and our volunteers. And so having a little bit of vulnerability as a leader, which is not something I think as leaders of organizations or teams we often like to do, having that vulnerability can actually help validate and be a sense of support to your team. And try to celebrate success, whatever the success looks like, try to celebrate it as frequently as you can. And it also requires intentionality. So talking about coping and sharing strategies, creating spaces that people can both give ideas and also receive ideas. And as leaders, we need to model and label and praise the way we do the work, not just the fact that we're getting it done. So that's great if we're getting work done in that noon to 3 or midnight to 3 a.m. time frame. But that might not be a strategy that works for everyone. So what we need to do is to make sure we are affirming that with staff that they're moving through and getting the work done, even when everything's kind of up in the air and crazy right now. Affirming that they're getting it done and praising them for getting it done, even though it might not be typically what work looks like. And then next here, on the next slide here, that compassion satisfaction. A couple things that we can do is reframing, so helping folks identify what they can do, not what they can't do in this time of the pandemic. Those celebrations, continuing to praise. But here's a really important thing that I want to pass on to you as leaders and supervisors, and I know I have to constantly tell myself this. What we can't do and we can't always control is you might not be able to save every job. This sector was already having some heavy financial burdens prior to the pandemic and prior to the most recent disaster, and those things have only increased added pressure. And I know everyone's working every day to make sure that we can maintain our staff levels. But the reality is in that situation that might not happen. We also can't keep everyone healthy and home forever, and that's where that equity piece comes in. You know, some staff may need to be at home much longer, but we might not be able to do that. As a function of some of the fields that some of you work in, that may not just be possible, or you have a state contract or a federal contract that dictates whether or when you go back in to in-person work. We also can't protect all the kids and all the adults from some of the suffering that's going on now, and we also can't do the work that we've done the same as before. And so we have to honor these things that are a struggle for us as leaders as well. But what we can do is be that sense of calm, try to help regulate with our teams, be a role model, again, showing that vulnerability and that compassion, and also accept where we just cannot do things or we have to let things go. help do that problem solving, give that time yourself to well-being and self-care, and make sure your staff are doing it as well. And be that person in the organization that others can lean on, especially if you're in a larger organization and you are supervising supervisors, helping them not only learn these skills, but also being that shoulder for them to lean on as well. And finally, looking at making meaning. What are some of the things that we're learning that are positive? Are there things we're doing now we want to keep doing after this pandemic ends? What are the habits that we're building now that's still going to be useful? And I think all of us would say that we've started a few things that we want to continue, and we've let go of a few things that we are okay with continuing to have gone after the pandemic. And so just acknowledging and being aware of that. And so I think that's most of my slides. Oh, just a few thoughts, but again, as a leader, you don't have to have all the answers. You can't guarantee an outcome. And so this is a time that might test us as leaders, but caring for ourselves and honoring where our staff is at is really some of the most important things that we can do.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for presenting. There were so many times I wanted to jump in and engage and ask questions, but I knew that we needed to get through this presentation.
Yeah.
So I'll say Lisa is also one of those folks who, I think you emailed me these slides at 12:01 a.m. So we're all, I think, working around the clock, and you are doing this too. So can you just really quick share a little bit about the community of practice that Iowa ACES has convened? And then I know you have another call to get on.
Oh, yeah, actually I have a couple minutes, so you don't worry about my time. That's okay. So we started back in June what we call community of practice calls that anyone can join in. You guys are all welcome to, and we don't have the next one scheduled yet, but it'll be sometime in September, where anyone that we've done any version of this training with is welcome to join. It's all supervisors, leaders, of organizations in the nonprofit or related fields, and you can call in, join, and usually we send a couple questions up front that folks can think about, but it's just about an hour of time once a month where we process with each other what we're seeing within our organizations, maybe challenges we're seeing, or just as leaders to have a space to share some of the struggles during this time. And so I'll be sure to share with Brianne, and then we'll also have posted on our website and Facebook page when we have that September one scheduled.
That'll be great.
So
and we'll be doing kind of a mini version of that in our breakouts today. I took some of the questions that you had on, I think it was a previous slide for discussion. So with that, maybe let's go to the next slide and we can talk about what trauma-related tensions have you seen surfacing in your organization. Thank you so much, Lisa. I think I speak on behalf of all of us that was extremely helpful. So we're going to talk about those tensions, and I loved that framing that Lisa had of, the different tensions we're living through right now, and then how are we engaging with each other in ways that are strengthening now and into the future. So those will be our main breakout questions, and that reminds me that I have to build them. There we go. So I just wanted to give you the chance then now to indicate which breakout room you would like to be a part of, and I'll do my best to assign you and move you around to whichever breakout room you would like to be in. We'll be sticking around in the main room to talk a little bit about strategic collaboration grants, if anybody is interested in that. And then let me, just take a moment to figure out where everybody's landing. those human services folks, we had just talked about, this being maybe a little bit different than some of the other fields. So, having kind of the extra layer of direct service as well. So I am going to, sorry, just real quick, I'm looking to make sure. And then if you want to stay in the main room, just don't accept uh, my invitation to go to a breakout room. I'm going to open those and then we'll give you about 20 minutes. It looks like room 2 is a bit bigger than room 1. Let me double check. And I know a couple of you are on the phone. So if you want to switch, just let me know, hop back, and I will, Bridget, don't accept when I zoom you out. I did something a little bit weird today, so sorry. I'm going to open up the rooms. Again, we're going to center our discussion around those 2 questions, trauma-related tensions you've seen, and then how you're engaging with each other in ways that are strengthening now into the future. And hang out with me. You just don't have to join a room if you want to stay and talk strategic collaboration grants. Thanks. Okay, I'm going to give folks a chance to zoom out to rooms if they would like. And it looks like we have a group that is not joined yet. So if you'd like to stick around in the main room and ask any questions, I will give you that opportunity. Let me know if for whatever reason you can't use your microphone. And we'll go ahead and, I got some unassigned ones. We can go ahead and talk about the strategic collaboration grants. So feel free to unmute yourselves. We did have our first cycle that went this past week, I think. Trey, did you want to chat about that?
Oh, I was just wondering if you'd share what type of projects they're
Yeah, I should have had this pulled up, but we had one strategic alignment project from 2 larger youth serving organizations that needed a little support as they go past the due diligence phase into kind of what's next. We don't know if that'll be a merger or kind of exactly what form that will take. We had a study and some implementation similar to the Directors Council One Economy work. We have a project underway for the Latinx population. And so looking at some of those barriers for economic access and then kind of beyond community leadership. We have, and let me see, I think, sorry, I was going to see if I can pull up the screen with what we had granted. So we had those 2. We had really a group of executive directors from culturally specific organizations that wanted to have some facilitated dialogue about prospective alignments or co-programming, and that was interesting because there were a couple of arts and culture orgs who were also part of that conversation, but really focusing in on building trusting relationships, not necessarily with a here's the end that we want to see, but they knew they couldn't keep doing what they were doing alone and so they wanted to build those relationships. And then the ACES 360 grant was really around that advocacy space, that they're kind of taking their coalition and collaboration and strengthening it to be sort of a long-term advocate for equitable recovery, especially for children and people experiencing those ACEs. So those were the first 4, I believe. We had a couple others. And then, the committee really went back and said, here's our feedback. We'd like to entertain it in the next round. So I know you had some ideas, and if you wanted to talk specifically about anything, we absolutely could. Anything?
I don't know if I'm prepared to do that right now.
Yeah, we can set up
Moving,
we can set up another conversation if you'd like. I know, what we're not really funding, which I think a lot of the initial questions were around, was, basically programming type work. And we have a co-programming as one of the potential areas, but I think the way that we've been talking about things is, what's going to be a more long-term what's going to lift up the sector with a little bit more of a long-term lens.
mhm.
And then with the programming example I'm using is like when groups came together to form centralized intake through primary healthcare. Like in the programming space, I would say that that's probably the best example that we have of like a past project that's been funded through our leadership grants. So we're still really using that leadership grant lens of what's the community problem that you're trying to solve, but being a little bit more COVID responsive and making sure that equity is central to that.
That's really helpful. I think that was one of the things we struggled with, even in looking at the information that was put out. Is what are the types of things you're looking? What direction are you looking to go? And instead of wasting your time, is some of these things we're thinking about even a fit or not? And internally, I know we were, Julie and I were struggling at times with figuring out what the answer was.
And I had a conversation with Julie kind of before we even officially launched the program, I think, but we were developing it. And so, I think that we're viewing this as a sector resiliency grant program too, and so it's not, an immediate response. It's sort of like what's going to help provide those strength and relationships, stability for a more long-term resiliency.
Outstanding. Thank you.
Sure. Barbara, I see you've got your camera on. So did you want to chime in or ask any questions?
Yes, a couple of things. First of all, thank you for that question and then your response to it, because it was similar to what I was going to ask in terms of what were some of the learning lessons, what's the refocus, what can we who are thinking about applying learn from the 4 that have been awarded. I think you've answered some of those questions, but maybe to elaborate to help us. I felt the same way as Trey when we were looking at, and our partners were looking at the information, the initial information that was shared. We had a number of ideas, but we weren't sure that we were going in the direction that you might be looking at. So the emphasis, what I'm hearing you say on the COVID and the leadership and the collaboration, is that right? Or do you want to expand on that?
Well, I think, they're not necessarily COVID specific projects. COVID has illuminated many inequities, that we maybe have been aware of, but what opportunities in this kind of COVID and hopefully post-COVID era will joining forces or collaborating help achieve, how can joining forces help achieve some of those goals? And so, we to be quite frank, we expect some consolidation in the sector. And I know, Trey and I have talked about this, and they have, some great experience having, merged or aligned with different organizations in the past. We're expecting that. And what we have learned is there isn't a lot of funding around that exploration period, right? Like there are a lot of organizations that are coming to some realizations, but and they have strong partnerships, but what does it take to help move those conversations forward? Sometimes it needs to be more facilitated dialogues. Sometimes that asset mapping is kind of why we have that second priority is there might be a group of organizations that come together and really need some assistance to lay out on the table and find out where are those gaps and where are those strengths that some organizations have, where others might have weaknesses. And so, we're obviously developing this grant program in the same kind of environment where you guys are living it, where we're trying to, be responsive and not just have our normal leadership grant cycle, but really meet the needs of the nonprofit sector, holding true to, there are some critical community goals that we have in Central Iowa. And so are there opportunities for collaboration that are going to help advance these critical goals? I think that's how I would articulate it. And I know, once we get into the grant language, it does feel maybe more vague. But those are a few examples. And I'd say, the example with ACEs was interesting because Delta Dental Foundation had granted them about half the amount that they needed for this advocacy role. And we've seen them as a strong coalition builder and collaborator. And so what expansion of their capacity could we provide, knowing that they have a plan for kind of long-term sustainability with that, to fill some
Good
gaps.
example. I appreciate that example. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd say the Latinx project is also one that, had been bubbling a little bit prior to COVID. And I think there are leaders who, because of COVID, have had the opportunity to come together in new and different ways to meet the needs of their community. And so then the conversation is, how does this live beyond this period? What what examples do we have in the community? And the Directors Council, and kind of the way that they've been able to illuminate through their blueprint for One Economy is I think a kind of the parallel project that the Latinx project is looking at right now.
Good examples. Thank you.
Yeah. This is it's a really interesting grant program, and we have a lot of different conversations. And obviously, like, arts and culture is also a subsector that has been deeply impacted. And so we're trying to think about, and we have funding through Bravo to address some of the collaboration opportunities within the arts and culture community. So looking at the regional assessment, regional cultural assessment, and some of those goals, and who's going to come together around those. So that is my update. But good. Well, I'm going to real quick just broadcast a message to the folks in the breakout rooms, and let them know. We'll give them a couple more minutes before we come back.
As you're doing that, maybe one more question that
Sure.
I probably know. But when is the next cycle? And one of the areas that you had suggested is to maybe initially follow up with you or another.
Yeah. We've had
Go ahead.
We've had good conversations. So the next cycle will be like September. Let me look at my calendar. They're doing monthly reviews, but the review each month is at a different date, just based on everybody's calendars. So I think getting a draft in the week of September 1st would allow them to review in the next cycle. And I've even been looking at drafts as they come in, and I don't vote on the committee. I just do my best to try and translate what their questions might be. And then there will likely be an October cycle, I would imagine, as well. And I'm sorry, I'm not working on two screens today. Otherwise, I would pull up some of the, I can pull up how much has been expended so far. I think they've granted out 61,000 of a $235,000 program. But I can find that information, and it'll be good to have when everybody comes back. Yeah, 63,100 in the first round, 171,900 remaining. Yeah, and those were the 4 projects that were outlined. Okay, I'm going to start closing those rooms, and then people will come back and we'll do a little recap. Trey, have you been seeing some of what Lisa was talking about with and Barbara? I mean, you guys are both kind of in in this realm of the work and trauma-informed supervision. Is this something that's been a conversation within your organizations already?
Yes, we're doing a lot of work with the Catholic schools right now on the topic, especially with the teachers and then the administration. We'll be working with the parents and the children as well. But this was very good. I have to say, I really appreciated the information because it was focused on leaders, on leaders, but it's applicable to a lot of areas. Will we be receiving the PowerPoint slides?
I can send those out. Yeah, we're trying to figure out sort of the cadence of what I have the marketing department do and what I just send out. So I just might send a recap and I can include these as a PDF. And then I know Lisa has also indicated that she's willing to give these presentations within other organizations as well. So, if you have a large supervisory staff, and you think that you would benefit, you can absolutely reach out to her about that. So, yeah.
I'd echo what Barbara said. Honestly, both internally and externally. I mean, the back to school stressors on our young parents and kids in isolation, and then certainly we're fortunate. Jen, I don't know if anyone knows Jen Stout, but she's really immersed in trauma-informed care and ACEs, as is Ashley Morey. So we have a couple staff members who are fairly well versed in it and fairly well, very passionate about making sure that we utilize it as a tool as we evaluate needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I thought was interesting. Oh, we got everybody bouncing back, so my ears are ringing with all of the returners. But I thought it was interesting that in the sector we're talking about trauma-informed care so frequently, but to shine the light back on ourselves and really live that as a organizational value, I think was really helpful and interesting. So, well, welcome back everyone from the breakout rooms. If we can go to the next slide, Bridget. I just wanted to have a little time and space for any network updates that you might have. I hope you've seen that the Nonprofit Recovery Fund was extended by the IEDA late last week. And, we've heard from them that even if you didn't feel like you fit into the priorities immediately, go ahead and apply. They really want to get a good sense of, what is the overall need of the nonprofit sector. And so, get your information in there if you haven't yet. I would encourage that. I also wanted to highlight that we are going to be having a board basics training. So we're ramping up our onboard series again, and you can access that training link on our website. It's going to be $10. We'll be doing it virtually. And then I encourage anybody in the chat to add any opportunities that your organization has coming up or announcements that you'd like to make. And then let's go to I think the last slide. What's looking ahead. So on September 2nd, the first Wednesday, we'll be having a group of local funders on to talk about lessons from the pandemic and looking ahead at how their thought process or funding might be impacted in the future. So I anticipate we'll have at least 5 different foundation leaders, and then our breakouts will allow for some extra time with each of those or additional foundation leaders. So if you have a specific funder who you work with closely and haven't been able to get time with, or want to have a small group chat, I think that's probably how we'll structure the coming session. And then on the topic that we talked about today, I have just had on my radar a couple of free webinars, that kind of seem like they expand upon or are related to what Lisa talked about today. Iowa State University, CIRAS, is hosting a free session tomorrow on the basics of connecting, uniting, and producing as a team. And I would imagine that Mike Wagner will be kind of talking about and acknowledging the virtual environment in which we're living. I don't know if anybody has seen Mike Wagner present, but I find him to be really fun and engaging. And so that's a free opportunity. And when I send out, people have asked if I could send out the slides from Lisa. I will do that as a PDF, and then I'll send the links to these two sessions. I also noticed Workhound, which is a local startup that started in the trucking industry that has expanded to other frontline workforce type employee engagement work. They are hosting a free webinar about building a culture of trust. And one of my favorite local speakers, Sarah Noel Wilson, is going to be on that panel. So, if you have folks in your organization who are really tasked with keeping after that organizational culture, those might be two good opportunities to share with them. And again, I will include that in a quick recap that will be coming from my email. And so thanks, Matt, for adding in the chat that you're having cocktails and cabaret virtual gala. Looking forward to seeing some more information about that. And then the United Way 21-day equity challenge kicking off in October. And so reach out to Luke Lynch from United Way if your organization would like to be interested in supporting and promoting that event, either within your staff or kind of externally to those you serve. So great, thanks for sharing those updates, everybody. I look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks, and go ahead and just, add anything else in the chat. I'll turn off my video and mute, but anything else you want to share, I can send it in the recap as well. So thanks so much for your time. And again,
okay, I'm on Community Circles Conversations, and they just put an email up.
Okay.
United Way is
All right. I'll talk to you guys
21-day
later.
equity
Thanks.
challenge to
Have
be
a great
held in
week. Bye.
October. And we are looking for supporters to help promote the event. And they're asking this organization